let me first give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about in this tutorial. So first we'll look at the bones of the head, which are divided into two groups, the bones of the neurocranium and the bones of the viscerocranium. Then we'll move on to look at the bones of the neck, which are of course the cervical vertebrae. So to start off this tutorial, let's look at the bones of the head, or the skull. The skull is made up of over 20 individual bones that, as we know, can be divided into two groups, those of the neurocranium and those of the viscerocranium. Let me draw a line on our nice image of the skull here to show you roughly where this division occurs. So the neurocranial portion of the skull houses and protects the brain, whereas the viscerocranial portion forms the face. Now let's begin by looking at the bones of the neurocranium. The first bone that we'll look at today is the frontal bone. This unpaired bone, which is one of the bones that encases the brain, consists of three parts. The squamous part, which makes up the largest portion of the frontal bone, encompasses the area of the forehead and houses the frontal sinuses. The orbital part, which is essentially the part of the frontal bone that contributes to the bony orbit or eye socket. And if you look at our skull, you can see that I've now highlighted this part in blue for you. And finally, we have the nasal part, which articulates with the frontal processes of the maxillae and the nasal bones. In our image on the right, I've labelled the left nasal bone, and I've drawn a line to show you where this articulation occurs. If we view our skull from the side, we can see the left temporal bone. This paired bone forms part of the base of the cranial vault and is made up of four parts. The squamous part, which is thin and partly translucent, I've highlighted the region for you in blue on our image. The tympanic part, which relates to the area I've highlighted around the external acoustic meatus. The styloid process, the spiky process we can see located just below the tympanic part. And the petromastoid part, which includes the mastoid process of the skull. Along with forming part of the base of the cranial vault, the temporal bones also participate in the formation of the lateral walls of the skull. Next, let's have a look at the parietal bones. The parietal bones are bilateral bones found on both sides of the neurocranium, and in our image we can see the left parietal bone. These roughly square-shaped bones are bordered anteriorly by the frontal bone, posteriorly by the occipital bone, and laterally by the temporal bone and the sphenoid bone. If we look at our skull from a posterior perspective, we can see the unpaired occipital bone highlighted in green.